Hi everyone, I'm Richard Lecours and I'm with Citizenship and Immigration Canada, and I'm really happy to be here, and I know that we're going to have some vigorous conversation based on some of the presentations I just heard, so I'm looking forward to that. For my part, my work is around settlement in Canada, and when we use that term, what we're talking about is when someone arrives in Canada and is looking for help in integrating into Canadian society and also meeting their basic needs and sometimes very high needs, particularly for some refugees, and making sure that when they were talking about safety blankets a little earlier, we want to make sure there's safety blankets for those people as much as possible. And that gives me a lot of satisfaction doing that. So my background isn't really in the same areas as some of the topics that we're touching on, which is perhaps around asylum seekers, for example, but I'll do my best, and I expect to learn a lot from being here with you folks. And so for the outline, I know that we don't have much time, and really I can't really explain any of our programs in any kind of satisfactory way, so I'm going to have to rely on the fact that a lot of you already know that and count on that. So I hope you can forgive me for that, but what I do want to do is at least give a little bit of a basic overview to frame our conversation for the questions that might come. And you've probably seen some of the numbers that I'm going to start putting up on different graphs. But what I really wanted to share was the magnitude of the problem related to refugee issues around the world. Here we're talking about an enormous number of people who are displaced, and most refugees stay refugees. And so it's really important for finding a solution, a worldwide, global solution for dealing with this. And what it also speaks to is that there's so many people who have these issues that we really need to find we need to use our resources as well as possible in order to be able to help as many as we can, and that's a lot of what the reflection has been of late. I think what's driving some of the process, and which leads to maybe indirect consequences, which is part of what's being talked about with others. And from my own experience, every time you set some kind of policy or rules, there are consequences that are either unintended or intended, and you need to deal with that as well. So the priority really is to focus on specific refugee situations now, using those resources, and instead of being tied to our past inventories. And I'm using the word inventories because I hate that word. When what we're really saying is people in immense need, and when you have so many people, millions of people in this kind of situation, then you really need to do something about that. How can a refugee stop being a refugee? Really, there's only three ways, and the first being that you can go back home to your country, and about 10% of refugees end up having that opportunity. Largest recent returns would be Liberians, Sierra Leone, and Burundi. Some get locally integrated, and that's really the asylum seekers or asylum claimants, and they're about 2% of the world's refugees. And then finally, most refugees stay for a very, very long time. We're talking about 17 to 20 years in a refugee camp or in urban settings, which we often refer to as protected refugee situations and need to be addressed. A global context around the resettlement spaces, if I could call it that, by different countries, and you may not be able to read that very well, or the colors, but essentially the United States is the big, the Pac-Man part, and Canada and Australia are the two next largest who receive, who allow for resettlement in their countries. Overall, the good news is that there's an increasing amount of interest. From 2002, where there's only perhaps 12 countries talking about this, we're up to around 40 having dialogue, and while only 27 are doing something about it. But really, these 5 or 6 are the main ones. The European Union has been joining in with 6,000 spots that they're now taking, and they're hoping to increase that to around 20,000 by 2020. So I'm not going to touch too much on what you're seeing in front of you, but it's really to say what's our response in Canada to this. And the first issue, the first pillar that we were talking about people being able to go back to their homes. Through CEDA, Canada provides hundreds of millions of dollars for development work. for directly or indirectly making impacts on the well-being of refugees or in those host countries to make it more effective for them staying there. So $300 million to Iraq. Afghanistan has been the largest recipient in the last 10 years of humanitarian aid, $46 million to Syria just now. The second one would be around domestic asylum seekers, around 10 to 15,000 people a year. And the third, of course, is through resettlement, and that would be the GARs, government-assisted refugees, privately sponsored refugees, and now what we call VORs, or visa office referred people, where they're trying out a new pilot as part of these changes, where they're looking for UNHCR to identify people, and then they're being directed to privately sponsored groups, and there's a certain amount of financial assistance that the Government of Canada also provides. So with this final one around the numbers that I'm throwing at you, I want to show how the approach of focusing on 3 to 5 countries, which is really where we're going now, how that fits in with, it's really more an acknowledgement of what we've always been doing. On this pie chart, this is around government-assisted refugees. On a 5-year average, 70% of all the GARs come from 5 countries, so Iraq, Colombia, Burma, Bhutan, and Afghanistan. And for the privately sponsored refugees, 83% come from 4 countries only, Iraq, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, and Eritrea. Now, there's 60 countries that are source countries out of all of that we receive, but the bulk, the vast majority, are from these smaller group of places. So essentially the principle behind all of this is really to say that by focusing on 3 to 5 areas of where we would be selecting refugees moving in the future, we can really look at doing more overseas programming in those locations to help prepare refugees before they come. And in some ways we have to be careful because receiving large numbers of people from a particular group has shown us, being our service providing organizations, have shared with us that has an impact, a negative impact around their settlement. So we're going to be placing them across Canada. And the best feature of this is you're minimizing brain drain, really, because sometimes the people who can step forward among refugees are the ones with the greatest education skills, and then you're taking those people away from those refugee situations back in the source country, and by having a longer period of time where you're bringing people through, then they can actually become supports when the rest of their communities arrive in Canada. So I can sort of jump over the next 3 slides because you heard a lot about it from Cynthia and Don and Ranu, but essentially what we're talking about is some of the changes to the Immigration Refugee Protection Act of late, and I know that that's going to be a part of what we're going to be talking about because this relates to asylum seekers. And the intention is really to provide a quicker path for refugee protection for those who are determined to have need. And I think that's the question, that the debate is around who is determined to have need. And so here, this is just sort of a recap of the whole process, and around that IRB is the independent body that we rely on to make those determinations. They have most refugee claimants who are unsuccessful can appeal it under the Refugee Appeal Division. All of the claimants have a recourse through the judicial review in the federal court. And then I mentioned here that I guess with some of these changes we've gone from an 18-month backlog, which was in its own way a terrible thing to do to people, to a very, very fast process. They're talking about designated countries of origin and the minister who makes those determinations now. There's a framework for how those determinations are done, so it's not quite as arbitrary as it might have sounded, but and I noticed that I put in twice previously when a refugee claims it's an average of 18 months. I wasn't trying to hammer home that point, it's just me being absent-minded. So I put this in just to say that these are sort of the basis that the IRB is making its decisions, and I wanted to emphasize where it talks about membership in a particular social group, which can include lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender individuals as part of that definition. So my area, I'm down to 1 minute, and it's the area that I know something about, and it's around our settlement funding when people arrive in Canada. And I'm going to speak specifically to Ontario because that's what I know best. But whatever we're talking about, there's a certain consistency around that across Canada. The one I want to emphasize was the bottom one. Partnership programs facilitate access. A lot of my work is around building partnerships, for example, with school boards to do settlement workers in school programs, so that by having a partnership with another partner, we can go beyond some of our definitions who are eligible clients. Therefore, no matter what your status or how you've arrived in Canada, we can provide help to those clients. The same applies with, for example, I was involved with establishing 7 welcome centers in York Region and Durham Region, and again, those are made up of partnerships so that we can make sure that we're helping all clients as much as possible. And then in a similar way, a lot of our work is around developing local immigration partnerships, where what that means is that in all municipalities in Ontario pretty much, there's 40 some that participate. We have all of the social service providers, the social service network, including public health, housing, legal aid, employment stakeholders, and they look at how can we engage them more so that for people that CIC can't necessarily directly help, they can be much more effective in helping and understanding the issues for newcomers there. So for me, it's all about strengthening that security blanket that we were talking about. Same with, we have some capacity building for mental health professionals. I think refugees live all kinds of terrible experiences that require certain better understanding among that network. And so we have programs with CAMH, or the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, and with the Canadian Mental Health Association and Hong Fook Mental Health Association to build capacity within those people. And I guess I just wanted to wrap up with we're doing now something that I think is quite possibly could make a huge difference, is research through the Institute of Clinical and Evaluative Sciences, where we're linking our landing data with the Ontario health data so that they can look on status issues, so they could look at people from different categories, including refugees, and see what kind of health issues there might be. And just to give you a couple of examples, one around mental health for immigrant children and youth, and where they were finding some issues around self-harm, particularly with refugees, that required more attention perhaps than with other groups. And another one here, mental health use patterns. So I'm expecting a lot more studies of this sort that will help us understand some of the issues that newcomers are living through. So there's a continuum of approaches that are part of what we're doing, and when they arrive, I like to think there's a vigorous set of settlement programs to help them as well. Thank you very much.